Hi, everyone. I'm Gage Kelley, and I'm a researcher at Google. And I'm here today to talk about our case study on leveraging virtual reality to enhance diversity and inclusion training at Google. So, VR has been a technology where we've seen huge improvements over the last few years in terms of accessibility and openness, people using these technologies and having access to them in their homes, for games, and for other efforts. And we wanted to understand if we could bring this technology into the workplace to take a training that is otherwise framed as something that people just have to get through and actually be able to enhance it, make it more realistic, make it available to more people, and make it something that feels like a more important experience for people by leveraging some of the benefits of being immersive with VR. To do this, we had a design philosophy where we wanted to take scenarios that were based on real, actual experiences that people had. We wanted to make sure that we had good voice acting, characters, and people in these stories that sounded real and that made the world more real instead of just the traditional method of this training right now, which is reading scenarios. And we even based the locations on VR based on our real corporate offices so that the environment was more believable, it was more familiar, and people were really able to be more immersed into these trainings. So to do this, we actually enlisted volunteers within Google to help us design the scenarios. Again, to make sure that these were based and framed as much in real experiences. None of the scenarios are based just on one specific person's experience, but we were able to bring these together to amalgamate them from many of the experiences that people shared with us in this initial development. We then developed characters based on this in collaboration with our partners at a firm that does VR training, and finally did some Q&A testing on the scenarios that we developed. Throughout an initial testing phase, we had participants report over 100 problems through the course, through 7 different testing sessions. Again, just to show the iterative nature of this process. We didn't just go off in a room, develop these, and then hand them back out to people. But we really tried to iterate, work with the VR studio, work with the experts who knew how to do this, and design scenarios that, again, really landed for people when we ran these trainings. We ended up with 4 scenarios that I won't go through fully here, but each of them is in more detail in the full case study paper. But each of these are meant to cover a different piece of the work experience and how different situations with diversity, equity, and inclusion can come up in these scenarios so that we have different learning objectives for each one. We then ran sort of our final test training sessions for these scenarios. We had 23 members of Google's security team senior staff participate in these DEI trainings that were completely optional. We brought in volunteers from across our different DEI efforts, and we ran 90-minute sessions for this training, including some intro materials, a pre-survey, a demonstration of how to actually use the VR headsets for those that didn't have familiarity, then solo time within the VR headsets where participants could explore the different scenarios that we had created, and then a live debrief discussion that everyone participated in outside of the virtual environment. And overall, our participants found this to be a really useful experience. Almost everyone thought it was useful on a useful or very useful scale, and all 8 participants said the training was satisfying or very satisfying. In terms of positive aspects that we recorded from this initial training, participants found that they increased their understanding of some of these situations. We had a participant say the opportunity to experience microaggressions from the perspective of a member of a historically underrepresented group made the experience more valuable for them. We had another participant say that it just made empathy more real via the experience. We also found that participants enjoyed taking part in this training. We had a participant who said the time just flew by, and another who said immersion removes the sense of time from the training. You're more focused. And so we see this as some really good leading indicators that VR might be a path forward for doing some of this educational work. However, we did run into some problems as well. Some of these were around just the usability of the VR headsets themselves, where many of our participants lacked familiarity with them. It wasn't a VR headset that they had used before. It wasn't something that they necessarily enjoyed. We had one participant who said, I did not like the VR setup. but loved the first-person view of the cases a lot more. And so you can see these tensions between actually being able to run a good educational course within a VR environment, but also just the way the technology is still in some ways getting in the way. And finally, we had some areas of improvement for ourselves on this. We got feedback from our participants that there just wasn't enough graphic quality. The graphics weren't good enough. There wasn't enough realism in the scenarios themselves. We had one participant say parts of the training where there's a lot of head motion, you noticed some of the low resolution elements like people on video were very disorienting to them. And so we understand that there's a sort of real desire for just really high fidelity in these situations. And finally, participants reported a lack of agency. As with many DEI-related scenarios, or even scenario design in general, participants wanted to go further. They wanted to give an answer that wasn't one of the options that we had made available in the scenarios. They even wanted more conversation. They wanted the experiences to last longer. We had one participant who said, what happens if an individual pushes back on being called out for a microaggression? They wanted to see sort of more development along that storyline. So overall, from this very preliminary work, we want to talk about 5 things that we think are sort of both areas for potential improvement, but also the things that will sort of make or break VR training in diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces in the future. The first is hardware issues. Again, we had numerous issues from participants recorded about the hardware, and we hope that this will improve with time. Some of this will just happen as new VR headsets and other immersive experience devices and technology increase and get better and get cheaper and get lighter in terms of the physical devices. And so part of this is really just, when is the moment right for running these types of trainings in VR? Another is scaling costs. So we ran this with 23 participants across our workforce. Our workforce is well over 100,000 people. And so thinking about how to scale VR trainings, it's different than being able to just have everyone be able to log into a website and check something on a laptop they already have. We've been able to move some of those VR headsets around the country. Potentially, as we think about this, we would be able to have more VR headsets in more locations, really open this up globally. But even sort of doing the in-person debrief, which participants found to be really helpful, does include some scaling costs. This isn't something where we're just sending people off fully on their own. Additionally, we talked about fidelity and quality. Just how do we make sure that the training can improve to the level that people are expecting? And there are challenges here as well. The greater that you increase these fidelity and quality issues in VR, it really increases the expense. We want to have state-of-the-art experiences for participants, but that really requires the highest quality of game engine, the highest quality of renders, of textures, of all of the pieces that make up a virtual environment. Next up is scenario depth. We mentioned how participants wanted more freedom in the scenarios. They wanted the ability to take different paths down the conversation. They wanted, sort of the scenarios to go further. We think this is an area where generative AI might actually be able to help, where the large language models that we're seeing now, which weren't available in the same way when we did this research, could actually maybe sort of work in terms of these situations, and we could be able to have participants have more natural conversations in these scenarios. There are still some questions just educationally, though, about how you design learning objectives when you have more of a free range conversation. And finally, the last piece we want to cover is novelty. People really enjoyed this training. They found it new, they found it different. And that's because many of them have had to take DEI trainings for years. And so this was new and different. And I think there's a question of how much of that novelty is really leading to their attitudes being so positive. Or is it really that VR and the immersiveness of the environment, the way they can really have a more direct experience, is actually an improvement, or just feels like an improvement? And that'll really require these trainings to be rolled out in a more significant way, where people are taking them more regularly, and we understand if they're still as valuable. So with that, there's a lot of future work to do in this space. I hope we are all thinking about how to improve these types of trainings to really benefit all of our employees and all of our users and people who are in marginalized groups, to improve the experiences they're having. And if VR is one avenue for that, I would love to see it continue further. Thank you all so much, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at the conference.